The sound of my grandson's laughter echoed through the hallway as I carried his favorite dinosaur pajamas upstairs, the same ones I'd bought him for his 4th birthday last month. "We need our privacy," Cassandra's voice cut through the air like ice, stopping me mid-step on the staircase. She stood at the top of the landing, arms crossed, blocking my path to little Jake's bedroom where I'd been putting him to bed every night for the past 2 years. "This arrangement isn't working anymore, Eleanor. You need to find your own place." My son Marcus appeared behind her, avoiding my eyes as he nodded in agreement. "Mom, Cass is right. We're a family now, and we need space to grow without you constantly hovering." But what they didn't know was that I owned every brick, every beam, every square inch of the house they were trying to kick me out of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Hartman, and at 68 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal life could offer. I was wrong. Standing there on those hardwood stairs that my late husband Thomas and I had refinished together 23 years ago, holding my grandson's dinosaur pajamas while my own son and his wife tried to evict me from my own home, I realized that some betrayals come dressed as family concern. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Drive had been our dream home. Thomas and I had saved for 15 years to afford the down payment on this 4-bedroom colonial with its wraparound porch and mature oak trees. We'd raised Marcus here, celebrated holidays, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical within these walls. When Thomas died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, this house had become my sanctuary, my connection to all the memories we'd built together. Marcus had been struggling financially when his divorce from his first wife became final 2 years ago. The legal fees, child support, and splitting assets had left him nearly bankrupt. When he'd asked if he and 4-year-old Jake could move in temporarily while he got back on his feet, I'd welcomed them with open arms. My house had felt too empty, too quiet without family laughter filling the rooms. Then Cassandra had entered the picture 8 months ago. 32 years old, blonde, ambitious, and immediately charming in that calculated way that should have raised red flags. She worked in real estate, drove a leased BMW, and wore designer clothes that seemed expensive for someone who claimed to be building her career. But Marcus had been lonely, and Jake had warmed to her quickly, calling her Miss Cass with the innocent trust that only children possess. When Marcus and Cassandra announced their engagement after just 4 months of dating, I'd swallowed my concerns and focused on the positives. Jake would have a mother figure, Marcus seemed happier than he'd been since his divorce, and our family would grow. I'd even offered to help plan their small ceremony, which had taken place in our backyard under the oak tree where Thomas and I used to sit and watch Marcus play as a child. The newlyweds had honeymooned in Hawaii, a trip that seemed extravagant for someone supposedly struggling financially, but I'd assumed Cassandra had good savings from her real estate career. When they'd returned, tanned and glowing, I'd suggested they might want to start looking for their own place now that Marcus was doing better at his engineering job. "Actually, Mom," Marcus had said, settling into the living room chair that had been his father's favorite, "we were hoping we could stay a bit longer. Save up for a really nice place, you know, maybe help you with expenses here, since the house is getting older and needs maintenance." It had seemed reasonable at the time. The house was indeed getting older, and having help with utilities and upkeep sounded practical. I'd agreed to let them stay another year while they saved for their dream home, never imagining that they were actually saving to steal mine. The changes had been gradual at first. Cassandra had started rearranging furniture, claiming she was just freshening things up and bringing the decor into this century. My antique dining set, the one Thomas and I had bought at an estate sale during our first year of marriage, had been moved to the basement to make room for a sleek modern table she'd purchased without asking. Family photos had been relocated from prominent display areas to less visible spots, replaced with abstract art that looked like something from a hotel lobby. "Eleanor, you don't mind, do you?" she'd asked each time, but the question always came after the changes were already complete. "I just think the house has so much potential that's not being utilized." When I'd protested the removal of Thomas's reading chair from the living room, Cassandra had laughed that tinkling laugh that I was beginning to associate with her getting her way. "Oh, that old thing, it's so worn out, Eleanor. Besides, we need the space for Jake's new play area. The reading chair, where Thomas had spent countless evenings with his books and where I still sometimes sat to feel close to him, had been donated to charity before I could object further. The guest room where I kept my sewing machine and craft supplies had been converted into Cassandra's home office without discussion. I need a professional space for my real estate work, she'd explained when I'd discovered my sewing table dismantled and stored in the garage. You understand, right? My career is really taking off. Each change had been presented as reasonable, even beneficial. Each time I'd started to object, Marcus had supported his wife with comments about modernizing the house or making better use of space. Gradually, I'd found myself relegated to my bedroom and a small corner of the kitchen, like a guest in my own home. The final straw had come 3 weeks ago when I'd returned from my weekly grocery shopping to find contractors installing a lock on what used to be the family room. We're turning this into our private sitting area, Cassandra had announced cheerfully, somewhere we can relax as a couple without interruption. But this is where Jake watches cartoons, I'd protested. Where we read bedtime stories together. Jake can watch television in the basement rec room, Marcus had said, not meeting my eyes. It's better for him to have his own space anyway. The basement rec room was cold, poorly lit, and felt more like a bunker than a family space. But Jake had adapted with the resilience of childhood, and I'd found myself spending more time down there with him, reading stories and playing games away from the increasingly tense atmosphere upstairs. Tonight's confrontation had been the culmination of weeks of subtle and not-so-subtle hints that I was no longer welcome in my own home. During dinner, Cassandra had made pointed comments about how cramped the house felt with 3 adults. She'd suggested I might be happier in one of those lovely senior communities where I could make friends my own age and have activities planned for me. Think about it, Eleanor, she'd said, cutting her chicken with precise movements. You're rattling around in this big house, worrying about maintenance and upkeep. Wouldn't it be nice to downsize to something more manageable? Marcus had nodded enthusiastically. Mom, there are some really nice places about 40 minutes from here. You could have your own apartment, but with support services if you need them. And we could visit all the time. I'd listened to their rehearsed presentation with growing anger and disbelief. They were discussing my future as if I weren't sitting right there, as if my preferences and attachments meant nothing. When I'd politely but firmly stated that I had no intention of moving anywhere, Cassandra's mask had slipped slightly. Well, something has to change, she'd said, her voice taking on a harder edge. This living situation isn't sustainable long-term. Now standing on the staircase with Jake's pajamas in my hands, I understood what she'd meant. They weren't planning to move out and leave me in peace. They were planning to move me out and keep the house they'd gradually taken over room by room. Eleanor, we're not trying to hurt you, Cassandra continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. We're thinking about what's best for everyone. Jake needs stability, and Marcus and I need to build our life together. You've had your time in this house. Now it's our turn. My time, as if my life was something that had already ended, as if I was just a placeholder keeping their inheritance warm until they were ready to claim it. I looked at Marcus, searching his face for any trace of the boy I'd raised, the young man who used to call me his best friend and trusted advisor. Marcus, I said quietly, do you remember when you were 8, and you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with your baseball? You were so scared to tell me, because you thought I'd be angry. Do you remember what I told you? He shifted uncomfortably, finally meeting my eyes. You said that telling the truth might be scary, but it was always better than living with a lie. And what did we do together? We went to Mrs. Henderson's house, and I apologized and offered to pay for the window with my allowance money. His voice was barely above a whisper. That's right. And what did I tell you after Mrs. Henderson said she was proud of you for being honest? Tears had started forming in his eyes. You said that integrity was the most important thing a person could have, and that you'd always be proud of me as long as I tried to do the right thing. I nodded slowly. So I'm asking you now, son, are you doing the right thing? Are you being honest with me about what's really happening here? Cassandra stepped forward, placing herself between Marcus and me. Enough of this emotional manipulation, Eleanor. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We're offering you a chance to transition gracefully to a lifestyle that's more appropriate for someone your age. Take it. The condescension in her voice, the casual dismissal of my feelings, The assumption that she had any right to determine what was appropriate for my life finally broke through the polite facade I'd been maintaining for months. I looked directly at her, then at my son, and made a decision that would change everything. "You want to talk about what's appropriate," I said, my voice steady, despite the anger coursing through me. "Let's talk about the fact that neither of you has any legal right to make decisions about this house or my living arrangements." Cassandra laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Eleanor, please. You're 70 years old and living on a fixed income. You can barely manage the utility bills, let alone major repairs. Be realistic about your situation." 70. I was 68, but apparently Cassandra had been rounding up my age in her mental calculations about when I might become too feeble to resist their plans. And fixed income, if only she knew the truth about my financial situation. "Is that what you think?" I asked. "That I'm some helpless old woman who can't take care of herself? We think you're a woman who deserves to enjoy her retirement without the stress of maintaining a house this size," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was reciting talking points, probably ones Cassandra had fed him during their private conversations about my future. I set Jake's pajamas on the stair railing and looked around at the house I'd called home for over 2 decades. Every paint color, every piece of trim, every carefully chosen fixture represented hours of planning and years of saving. Thomas and I had poured our hearts into making this house a home, and I'd continued that work alone after his death. "You know what?" I said finally. "You're absolutely right about one thing. This living situation isn't sustainable long-term." Relief flooded Cassandra's face. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, Eleanor. I've already looked at several senior communities that would be perfect for you. Some of them even allow small pets if you wanted to get a cat for companionship." A cat for companionship, as if I were some lonely spinster who needed a pet to fill the void in her pathetic life. I almost laughed at how completely she'd misjudged me and my situation. "Oh, I agree something needs to change," I continued. "I just think we have different ideas about what that change should be." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean, Mom?" I smiled for the first time all evening, and something in my expression must have registered as dangerous because Cassandra's triumphant smile faltered slightly. "I mean that you're right, Marcus. It's time for you to build your life with your wife and son, in your own home. It's time for this family to have some privacy."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I picked up Jake's pajamas and walked past both of them toward his bedroom. "I'll give you 60 days to find another place to live." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel them staring after me as I continued down the hallway, but I didn't look back. I had calls to make, documents to review, and plans to set in motion. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman who could be bullied into giving up everything she'd worked for. They were about to learn how wrong they were. After I'd tucked Jake into bed and read him 3 chapters of his favorite book about a brave knight who saved a dragon instead of slaying it, I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely in my own home. I walked to my closet and moved aside the winter coats to reveal a small fireproof safe that Thomas had installed years ago. Inside were documents that Cassandra and Marcus had never seen. Papers that would reshape their understanding of exactly who they'd been trying to manipulate. The deed to the house, with my name as the sole owner after Thomas's death. Bank statements showing account balances that would surprise anyone who assumed I was living on a fixed income. Investment portfolios that Thomas and I had built over decades of careful saving and smart financial planning. Most importantly, there was a folder labeled insurance that contained life insurance payouts, pension fund disbursements, and the proceeds from Thomas's retirement accounts. Money that I'd never touched, never mentioned, never flaunted, because I'd been raised to believe that financial security was something you built quietly and protected carefully. Thomas had been an aerospace engineer with a talent for investing. I'd been a nurse who'd worked full-time until Jake was born, then part-time to help with childcare while still maintaining my own retirement savings. Together we'd accumulated far more wealth than our modest lifestyle had ever suggested. We'd driven used cars, cooked meals at home, and taken our vacations camping rather than staying at luxury resorts. The house had been paid off 8 years ago, a fact I'd never shared with Marcus because Thomas and I had believed in teaching our son the value of hard work and financial responsibility. We'd helped him with college expenses and a modest down payment on his first house, but we'd never wanted him to rely on our wealth instead of building his own success. After Thomas's death, I'd continued living the same quiet, frugal lifestyle we'd always maintained. Not because I had to, but because it felt right, because it honored the values we'd shared. The only extravagance I'd allowed myself was transforming the backyard into the garden Thomas had always dreamed of, complete with a greenhouse and raised beds for vegetables. Now, sitting on my bed with these documents spread before me, I realized that my discretion about our financial situation had been misinterpreted as financial vulnerability. Cassandra had looked at my 10-year-old Honda, my preference for shopping at discount stores, and my careful budgeting habits and assumed I was struggling to make ends meet. She'd built her entire strategy around the belief that I was a burden Marcus was nobly supporting, a financial drain on their household that they could eventually convince to relocate somewhere cheaper and more convenient for everyone else. The irony was breathtaking. They'd been living in my house, eating food I'd purchased, using utilities I'd paid for, all while planning to evict me because they thought I couldn't afford to live there. Tomorrow I would begin making phone calls, but tonight I allowed myself to remember the conversation I'd had with Thomas during his final weeks. He'd been worried about leaving me alone, concerned about how I'd manage both emotionally and practically without his partnership. Eleanor, he'd whispered from his hospital bed, his voice weak but his mind still sharp, promise me you won't let anyone take advantage of your kindness. You're stronger than you know, smarter than you show, and worth more than you believe. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I'd promised, holding his hand and meaning every word. But in the 3 years since his death, I'd gotten comfortable being taken care of by Marcus, had enjoyed feeling needed and useful as a grandmother and household contributor. I'd forgotten Thomas's warning about my own strength until tonight, when Cassandra's casual cruelty had finally awakened something in me that had been sleeping too long. My phone buzzed with a text message from my sister Patricia, who lived across the country but called regularly to check on me. How are things with the newlyweds? Still enjoying having a full house? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, things are about to change. I'll call you tomorrow with details. Patricia responded immediately. Everything okay? You sound mysterious. I'm fine, I replied. Better than fine. I'm remembering who I used to be. The next morning, I woke before dawn and made coffee in the quiet kitchen, savoring the peace before the rest of the household stirred. I'd always been an early riser, but lately I'd been getting up even earlier to have a few moments of solitude before Cassandra's morning routine took over the common areas. I called my attorney first. Robert Chen had handled Thomas's estate and had been encouraging me to update my own will and estate planning documents. When I explained the situation with Marcus and Cassandra, he was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor, I have to ask, did you ever formally document any financial arrangements with your son regarding the house? Any rental agreements or shared ownership documents? Nothing formal, I admitted. He asked if he could stay temporarily, and I said yes. I've been paying all the household expenses, but I never asked him for rent or utilities. And they don't know about your actual financial situation. They think I'm barely getting by on Social Security and Thomas's pension. They don't know about the life insurance, the investments, or the fact that the house is completely paid off. Robert chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Eleanor, you're describing a textbook case of elder abuse attempt. They're trying to manipulate you into giving up your assets based on false assumptions about your vulnerability. The term elder abuse sent a chill through me. I'd heard stories about family members taking advantage of elderly relatives, but I'd never imagined it could happen to me. I wasn't frail or confused, or dependent on others for care. I was a competent adult, who'd simply been too trusting of her own family. What do you recommend I do? First, document everything. Their demands that you move, any threats or pressure tactics, any changes they've made to your home without permission. Second, give them formal written notice that they need to vacate the property. And third, change the locks the day they move out. After hanging up with Robert, I called my financial advisor, Sarah Martinez, who'd been managing my portfolio since Thomas's death. Sarah had been after me for years to be more open with Marcus about my financial stability, arguing that it would give me more independence and confidence in making decisions about my future. Eleanor, I'm not surprised this is happening, Sarah said when I explained the situation. Financial predators often target people who appear vulnerable, even family members. The fact that you've been so modest about your wealth has probably made you seem like an easier target. How much are we talking about? I asked. I mean, I know I'm comfortable, but I've never looked at the total picture. Sarah was quiet for a moment, presumably pulling up my accounts. Eleanor, between your savings, investments, retirement accounts, and the value of your property, you're $8 million. You're not just comfortable, you're wealthy. The number took my breath away. Thomas and I had always focused on monthly budgets and annual goals rather than total net worth. We'd known we were doing well, but hearing the actual figure made me realize how dramatically Marcus and Cassandra had misjudged my situation. What would you recommend for someone in my position, who's dealing with family pressure to give up her independence? I'd recommend that you stop hiding your financial strength and start using it strategically. You have options most people can only dream of. You could travel, relocate, renovate your home, support causes you care about, or simply enjoy the security of knowing you'll never be dependent on anyone else for your basic needs. After the phone calls, I spent an hour walking through my house with fresh eyes, making a list of all the changes Cassandra had made without permission. Thomas's reading chair, donated, my antique dining set banished to the basement. Family photos, relocated to make room for impersonal artwork. The family room, converted to their private space with a lock I didn't have a key to. Each item on the list represented another small violation of my autonomy, another step in their campaign to make me feel like a guest rather than the homeowner. When I reached the bottom of the stairs where the confrontation had taken place the night before, I noticed something I'd missed in the darkness. A small stack of brochures on the hall table, partially hidden under a magazine. I picked them up and felt my blood pressure rise. Sunset Manor, gracious living for active seniors. Pine Ridge Community, where independence meets support. Golden Years Residence, your next chapter starts here. Cassandra hadn't just been making casual suggestions about senior living. She'd been researching specific facilities, probably visiting them, gathering information for the day when I'd finally capitulate to their pressure. The brochures were glossy and expensive looking, featuring photos of smiling elderly people engaged in arts and crafts activities, group exercise classes, and communal dining experiences. I could imagine Cassandra's sales pitch. Look how happy everyone looks, Eleanor. You'd have so many activities, so many opportunities to make friends, your own age. And we'd visit all the time, wouldn't we, Marcus? The most galling part was that some of these facilities looked genuinely nice. If I were actually struggling financially, if I were genuinely having trouble maintaining my independence, if I had no other options, I might have considered them. But I wasn't struggling, I wasn't failing, and I had plenty of options. I was being manipulated by people who thought I was too old, too naive, and too vulnerable to resist their plans for my future. That afternoon, while Cassandra was at work and Marcus was at his office, I called a locksmith and had them rekey every lock in the house. It was my legal right as the property owner, and I wanted to make a point about who actually controlled access to this home. When the locksmith asked if I wanted to give spare keys to family members, I declined. I'll decide that later, I told him, tucking the new keys into my purse with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. Next, I called a security company and arranged for a complete alarm system upgrade, including cameras for the front and back entrances. If Marcus and Cassandra were going to continue living here during their 60-day notice period, I wanted everything documented. I also wanted them to understand that I was no longer the passive, accommodating woman they thought they could manipulate. My final call of the day was to a property management company that specialized in rental homes. If Marcus wanted to continue living in a house I owned, we could certainly arrange that. For fair market rent, with a proper lease agreement, and with clear boundaries about who made decisions regarding the property. That evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Marcus came home from work. He seemed subdued, probably still processing the previous night's conversation and uncertain about how to proceed. "Mom," he said carefully, "Cass and I have been talking, and we think maybe we all said things we didn't mean last night. Maybe we can work something out that makes everyone happy." I continued stirring the soup I was making, a recipe Thomas had loved that filled the house with the comforting aroma of herbs and vegetables. "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" "Well, we were thinking, maybe we could help you more with the house expenses, take on more of the maintenance responsibilities. Make this a true partnership, instead of feeling like we're all stepping on each other's toes." It was exactly the kind of reasonable-sounding proposal I would have considered a week ago. Marcus was offering to contribute more while still getting to stay in the house, and he was framing it as a partnership rather than charity. A month ago, I might have been grateful for the offer. "That's thoughtful of you, Marcus, but I've been doing some thinking too, and I've realized that you and Cassandra were right last night. This living arrangement isn't working anymore." He looked relieved, probably assuming I'd accepted their plan for me to move out. "I'm glad you're being open to change, Mom. Cass found some really nice places that might be perfect for you." "Oh, I'm not going anywhere," I said gently, ladling soup into bowls. "This is my home, and I'm very happy here. But you're right that 3 adults in one household creates complications, especially when 2 of those adults are newlyweds, who need space to build their marriage." The confusion on Marcus's face was almost comical. "I don't understand." "I'm giving you and Cassandra 60 days to find your own place. I think it will be better for everyone, especially Jake, if he grows up in a home where his parents are the primary decision makers, and his grandmother is a loving visitor, rather than a live-in third wheel." Marcus set down the spoon he'd been holding. "Mom, we can't afford to rent a place that's big enough for our family. Housing costs have gone through the roof, and we're trying to save for a down payment on our own home." There it was. The financial reality that had been driving their campaign to remove me from my own house. They couldn't afford to move out, so they decided it would be easier to convince me to move out instead. It was a breathtakingly selfish solution to their housing problem. "I understand that housing costs can be challenging," I said, "but Marcus, you're 35 years old with a good job and an educated wife who works in real estate. If you can't afford appropriate housing for your family, then you need to either increase your income or adjust your expectations, not manipulate your mother into giving up her home." "We're not manipulating anyone," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're trying to find a solution that works for everyone. A solution that works for everyone would involve honest communication about needs and resources," I replied, "not pressure tactics and assumptions about my capabilities or preferences." Before Marcus could respond, we heard Cassandra's car in the driveway. I glanced at the clock and realized she was home earlier than usual, probably because Marcus had texted her about our conversation. I set a third bowl on the table and waited for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Cassandra entered the kitchen with the aggressive energy of someone ready for battle. Her eyes immediately went to the table where I'd left the senior living brochures, and I saw a flash of anger cross her face when she realized I'd found them. "Eleanor, I hope you've had time to reconsider your position from last night," she said without preamble. "Marcus told me you're still being unreasonable about the living arrangements." "I told her we're willing to contribute more to household expenses," Marcus added quickly, clearly hoping to avoid another confrontation. Cassandra shot him a sharp look that suggested they hadn't agreed on this approach. I had the distinct impression that Marcus was trying to find a compromise, while Cassandra preferred the more direct approach of simply pushing me out. "How generous of you to offer to contribute to expenses in your own home," I said mildly. "Unfortunately, I've already made other arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Cassandra's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope containing 2 documents, a formal 60-day notice to vacate that Robert Chen had prepared, and a rental agreement for the house if they preferred to stay as tenants rather than find another place to live. "You have 2 options," I said, placing both documents on the table. "You can move out within 60 days, or you can sign a lease agreement and stay as tenants. The monthly rent would be $2,800, which is below market rate for a house this size in this neighborhood." Cassandra grabbed the rental agreement and scanned it quickly, her face growing redder with each line she read. $2,800. That's ridiculous. We can't afford that. Then I suppose you'll need to find somewhere you can afford, I replied. The 60-day notice gives you time to explore your options. Marcus was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. Mom, I don't understand. Why are you doing this? We're family. Yes, we are family, I agreed. And family members should treat each other with respect, honesty, and consideration. Family members shouldn't try to manipulate each other into giving up their homes based on false assumptions about their capabilities or resources. False assumptions. Cassandra's voice was rising. Eleanor, you can barely afford to heat this house. We've seen your grocery bills, your utility costs, you're living paycheck to paycheck on your pension. I almost laughed at how completely wrong she was, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. What makes you think you know anything about my financial situation? We live here too, Marcus said. We see how carefully you budget, how you shop for sales, how you worry about repair costs. You see me living within my means and being responsible with money, I corrected. That's very different from struggling financially. Cassandra slammed the rental agreement down on the table. This is extortion. You can't suddenly decide to charge us rent for a house we've been sharing as family. Actually, as the homeowner, I can charge rent to anyone living in my house, I said calmly. I probably should have done it from the beginning, but I wanted to help Marcus get back on his feet after his divorce. That transition period is over now. We have rights, Cassandra insisted. We've been living here for 2 years. We've established residency. You can't just kick us out. You're absolutely right about residency rights, I agreed. That's why I'm giving you 60 days notice, which is more than the legal requirement, and I'm offering you the option to stay as tenants if you prefer that arrangement. Marcus looked between the two documents, clearly struggling to process this turn of events. Mom, where is this coming from? Yesterday you were fine with everything, and now suddenly you're treating us like strangers. Yesterday I was tolerating a situation that had gradually become untenable, I replied. But when you and Cassandra decided it was time for me to move out of my own home, I realized it was time for me to start making decisions based on my own needs and preferences, rather than everyone else's comfort. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of soup simmering on the stove. I could see both of them trying to recalibrate their understanding of the situation, struggling to reconcile the assertive woman sitting across from them with the accommodating mother and mother-in-law they thought they'd been managing so successfully. Finally, Cassandra spoke, her voice dripping with condescension. Eleanor, I think you're having some kind of episode. This isn't like you at all. Maybe we should call your doctor. Make sure you're thinking clearly. It was the perfect culmination of months of subtle insults disguised as concern. The suggestion that any deviation from their expectations meant I was mentally incompetent was both insulting and revealing. It showed exactly how they'd been viewing me, not as an autonomous adult with my own thoughts and preferences, but as a confused elderly person who needed their guidance and protection. My thinking has never been clearer, I said. In fact, I'm wondering why it took me so long to address this situation directly. I stood up from the table and walked to the counter where I'd left my phone. Since you seem concerned about my mental state, Cassandra, perhaps you'd like to speak with my attorney about the legal basis for the notices I've given you. His number is on both documents. The mention of an attorney seemed to penetrate their assumptions about my helplessness in a way that my words hadn't. Marcus's eyes widened, and Cassandra's confident demeanor flickered for the first time since she'd entered the kitchen. You hired a lawyer? Marcus asked. Mom, why would you do that without talking to us first? Because this situation has moved beyond family discussions into legal territory, I replied. When someone tries to pressure me into giving up my home, I need professional advice about my rights and options. Cassandra was reading the 60-day notice more carefully now, probably looking for loopholes or mistakes that might invalidate it. This is harassment, she said finally. You're retaliating against us for having an honest conversation about living arrangements. If you consider your honest conversation to be telling me I need to move out of my own house so you can have privacy, then yes, I suppose I am retaliating. I admitted, I'm retaliating by exercising my rights as a property owner to determine who lives in my home. Marcus slumped in his chair, looking more confused than angry. I don't understand how everything went wrong so fast. We were just trying to figure out a solution that would work for everyone. Your solution involved me giving up my home and moving to a senior community, I pointed out. My solution involves you finding your own home and me keeping mine. Which solution actually works for everyone? Before either of them could answer, Jake's voice drifted down from upstairs. Grandma Eleanor, can you come read my story? The sound of my grandson's voice calling for me, trusting and innocent, reminded me why this entire situation was so painful. Jake was the one who would suffer most from this conflict between the adults in his life. He was the one who would lose his stable home, his grandmother's daily presence, his sense of security, but he would also benefit from growing up in a home where his parents were confident, independent decision-makers rather than resentful dependents living in someone else's house. He would benefit from having a grandmother who maintained her own identity and resources, rather than allowing herself to be diminished by people who claimed to care about her. "I'll be right up, sweetheart," I called back, then looked at Marcus and Cassandra. "You have 60 days to decide which option works better for your family. I suggest you spend that time having honest conversations about your actual needs and resources, rather than assumptions about mine." I left them sitting at the kitchen table with their documents and went upstairs to read to Jake, who was waiting in his dinosaur pajamas with 3 books stacked beside his bed. As I settled into the rocking chair that had been in this room since Marcus was born, Jake climbed into my lap with the easy affection that made all the adult complications fade into the background. "Grandma Eleanor, why do Mommy Cass and Daddy sound upset downstairs?" he asked, his small hand patting my arm in the comforting gesture children use when they sense adult distress. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about important things," I told him honestly, "but that doesn't change how much we all love you. Are you and Daddy fighting like he used to fight with Mommy Sarah?" Jake's first mother had been his father's college girlfriend, and their relationship had been tumultuous even before their divorce. Jake had been too young to understand the details, but he'd absorbed the tension and uncertainty that had characterized his early years. "We're not fighting, sweetheart. We're just figuring out some changes that need to happen." I opened his favorite book, the one about the knight and the dragon. Sometimes change feels scary, but it can also lead to better things for everyone. As I read about the brave knight who chose friendship over conquest, I thought about the conversation happening downstairs and the choices that lay ahead for all of us. I'd spent the past 2 years trying to be the accommodating grandmother, the helpful mother-in-law, the woman who made everyone else's life easier at the expense of her own autonomy. Tonight I'd reclaimed my voice and my authority, but the real challenges were just beginning. After Jake fell asleep, I returned to my bedroom and found a text message from my sister Patricia. "Called to check on you, but it went to voicemail. Everything okay?" I called her back, settling into the window seat where I could see the garden Thomas and I had planned together. Patricia answered on the first ring, her voice warm with concern. "Eleanor, you sounded so mysterious in your text yesterday. What's going on?" I told her everything. The gradual takeover of my house, the pressure to move to senior living, the confrontation on the staircase, and my decision to serve them with formal notices. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of outrage or disbelief. "I cannot believe Marcus would go along with this," she said when I finished. "Thomas would be appalled. Marcus isn't malicious," I said, surprised to find myself defending my son even after everything that had happened. "He's just been influenced by someone who's very good at manipulation. Cassandra has convinced him that I'm a burden they're nobly supporting rather than a homeowner who's been subsidizing their lifestyle. And they have no idea about your actual financial situation, none. They think I'm living on Social Security and Thomas's pension, struggling to make ends meet. They see my frugal habits as evidence of financial desperation rather than responsible money management." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, you know I love you, but you've brought some of this on yourself by being so secretive about money. If Marcus understood your real situation, none of this would be happening." She was right, of course. My discretion about finances, which had seemed like appropriate modesty, had created the conditions that allowed Cassandra to build her entire strategy around false assumptions. If I'd been more open about my security, if I'd maintained clearer boundaries from the beginning, if I'd insisted on formal arrangements instead of informal family agreements, this situation never would have developed. I suppose I thought that keeping financial matters private was the dignified thing to do, I admitted. Thomas and I never flaunted our success, never wanted Marcus to feel entitled to wealth he hadn't earned. There's a difference between flaunting wealth and being honest about your independence, Patricia pointed out. You've been so determined not to seem like a rich woman that you've allowed people to treat you like a poor one. After we hung up, I sat in the dark thinking about her words. For 3 years since Thomas's death, I'd been living like a woman who needed protection, care, and guidance from her adult son. I'd accepted help with household decisions, financial planning, and social arrangements that I was perfectly capable of managing myself. Partly it had been grief. Making decisions alone after 42 years of partnership had felt overwhelming, and having Marcus take charge of practical matters had been a relief. But partly it had been a kind of learned helplessness, a gradual acceptance of other people's assumptions about my capabilities. Cassandra had accelerated this process, but she hadn't created it. I'd already been diminishing myself, already been stepping back from my own authority, already been accepting a reduced role in my own life. She'd simply recognized an opportunity and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heated voices in the kitchen. Through my bedroom floor, I could hear Cassandra's sharp tones and Marcus's defensive responses, but I couldn't make out the specific words. I dressed quickly and went downstairs to find them hunched over Cassandra's laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed pages and coffee cups. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, pouring myself coffee from the pot they'd already made. "You're up early for a Saturday." "We've been researching landlord-tenant law," Cassandra said without looking up from her screen. "You can't just decide to start charging rent without proper notice and documentation. There are legal procedures that have to be followed." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "That's why I had an attorney prepare the documents I gave you yesterday. Robert Chen specializes in real estate law, and he made sure everything follows proper legal procedures." Marcus looked up from the papers he'd been studying. "Mom, this rental agreement has all kinds of restrictions. No modifications to the property without written permission, no additional occupants without approval. Professional cleaning services at our expense when we move out. Standard lease provisions," I replied. "The same terms you'd find in any professional rental agreement." "But we're not tenants," Cassandra protested. "We're family. This is our home too." "Actually, this is my home," I corrected gently. "You've been guests for the past 2 years, and now I'm offering you the option to become tenants. Those are the only 2 legal relationships available for people living in someone else's property." Cassandra slammed her laptop shut. "This is ridiculous. You can't run a family like a business." "You're right," I said. "Family relationships should be based on mutual respect and consideration, not business transactions. Unfortunately, when family members start making demands about each other's living arrangements and property rights, business relationships become necessary." I sat down at the table with my coffee and looked at both of them. "I want you to understand something. I didn't wake up yesterday morning, planning to serve you with legal notices. I've been hoping for months that we could work out our differences through normal family communication." "Then why didn't you just talk to us?" Marcus asked. "Why go straight to lawyers and ultimatums?" "Because every time I tried to express concerns about the changes happening in my house, I was told I was being resistant to progress," I replied. "When I objected to moving my furniture or losing access to rooms, I was told I needed to be more flexible. When I questioned decisions that affected my daily life, I was told I was being difficult." Cassandra's face flushed. "We were trying to help you modernize and make better use of space. You were redecorating my house to suit your preferences and eliminating my personal belongings to make room for yours," I corrected, "without asking my permission or considering my feelings." "Those are normal adjustments when multiple families share space," Marcus said, but he sounded less certain than he had the day before. "Multiple families sharing space make decisions together," I replied. "They don't have one family unilaterally changing everything while the other family is expected to accept whatever happens." I stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the backyard garden. The morning light was illuminating the greenhouse, where I'd been growing herbs and vegetables, the raised beds that produced enough fresh food to supply our entire household, the fruit trees that Thomas and I had planted during our first year in the house. "Can I ask you both something?" I said without turning around. When you've been planning for me to move to senior living, what did you imagine happening to my garden? The silence behind me was answer enough. They hadn't considered my garden at all, hadn't thought about the 20 years of work I'd invested in creating this productive, beautiful space. It was just another asset they'd assumed would transfer to them along with the house. I spend 3 hours every morning tending those plants. I continued. I grow enough vegetables to feed us from spring through fall, enough herbs to supply my cooking year-round. I've developed varieties of tomatoes and peppers that are specifically adapted to our soil and climate. Some of those fruit trees won't reach maturity for another decade. I turned back to face them. Did either of you consider what it would mean for me to lose all of that? Or were you just thinking about having a ready-made landscape when you inherited the house? Marcus had the grace to look ashamed. I didn't think about the garden specifically. But Mom, you could start a new garden wherever you moved. Maybe even a bigger one. Marcus, I'm 68 years old. How many more gardens do you think I have time to create? How many more decades do I have to watch fruit trees grow to maturity? The weight of that reality settled over the kitchen like fog. For the first time, I think they were beginning to understand that their plan didn't just involve relocating me to a more convenient location. It involved stripping away everything I'd built, everything I'd cultivated, everything that connected me to the life Thomas and I had shared. Eleanor, Cassandra said quietly, we never meant to take away things that were important to you. But you did take them away, I replied. You took away my reading chair, my sewing room, my family photos, my privacy, my authority in my own home. You've been taking away pieces of my life for months while telling me it was for my own good. I returned to the table and sat down across from them. The senior living brochures you've been collecting promise activities and social opportunities. But they don't mention that residents give up the right to choose their own furniture, cook their own meals, or control their daily schedules. They don't mention that everything becomes communal and institutional. Some people prefer that kind of lifestyle, Marcus said weakly. Some people do, I agreed. But I'm not some people. I'm a specific person with specific preferences and attachments. I like cooking my own meals from vegetables I've grown myself. I like reading in the chair where my husband used to sit. I like having family photos where I can see them every day. Cassandra was studying the rental agreement again, running her finger down the list of monthly charges. $2,800 plus utilities. That's more than most people's mortgages. It's actually below market rate for a house this size in this neighborhood, I replied. I had a property management company provide a rental analysis. Comparable homes are leasing for $3,200 to $3,500 per month. We can't afford that, Marcus said flatly. Between my student loans, child support for Jake, and our regular expenses, we're already stretched thin. Then you need to make different arrangements, I said simply. You can find a smaller place you can afford, or you can increase your income, or you can adjust your lifestyle to accommodate higher housing costs, or you could continue letting us live here as family instead of treating us like strangers, Cassandra suggested, her voice taking on a wheedling tone that I was beginning to recognize as her default when direct confrontation didn't work. Family members who want to continue living in someone else's home don't usually suggest that the homeowner should move out, I replied. That's what convinced me we needed a more formal arrangement. My phone rang, interrupting the conversation. The caller ID showed my financial advisor's number, and I remembered that Sarah Martinez had said she might call over the weekend to discuss some investment options. I need to take this, I told them, and walked into the living room for privacy. Eleanor, I hope I'm not calling too early, Sarah said. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I wanted to follow up on some ideas for your situation. What kind of ideas? Well, you mentioned that your family doesn't understand your financial position, and that's creating problems with their expectations about your living arrangements. Have you considered being more transparent about your assets? I glanced toward the kitchen, where I could still hear Marcus and Cassandra discussing rental prices and budget calculations. I've always believed that financial matters should be private. Privacy is important, Sarah agreed. But so is protecting yourself from people who might take advantage of perceived vulnerability. Sometimes a little strategic disclosure can prevent bigger problems. What do you mean? I mean that if your son and daughter-in-law understood that you're financially secure, They might be more respectful of your choices, and less likely to pressure you into arrangements that benefit them at your expense. It was the same point Patricia had made the night before, and hearing it from my financial advisor gave it additional weight. Both women were suggesting that my discretion about money had become a liability rather than an asset. Sarah, if someone in my position wanted to demonstrate financial independence without being ostentatious about it, what would you recommend? Start with small changes that signal stability and confidence. Stop apologizing for spending money on things you want. Make decisions about your home and lifestyle, without asking for input from people who don't actually contribute to the expenses. Consider some visible improvements that show you're investing in your future rather than just maintaining the status quo. After hanging up with Sarah, I stood in the living room looking at the changes Cassandra had made to the space that had once reflected Thomas's and my shared taste. The modern furniture looked expensive but sterile. The abstract artwork added no warmth or personality. Even the lighting had been changed to something harsher and more dramatic. This room had once been a gathering place where our family and friends felt comfortable and welcome. Now it looked like a magazine display, beautiful but unwelcoming. It occurred to me that this transformation was a perfect metaphor for what had been happening to my entire life over the past year. I returned to the kitchen where Marcus and Cassandra were still discussing their financial options in hushed tones. They looked up when I entered, both wearing the guilty expressions of people who'd been caught planning something they knew was questionable. "I've been thinking about our conversation," I said, settling back into my chair, "and I realize there are some things I should clarify about my situation." "What kind of things?" Marcus asked cautiously. "Financial things. You both seem to be operating under some misconceptions about my resources and capabilities." Cassandra leaned forward, her real estate agent instincts probably sensing an opportunity. "Eleanor, if you're having money problems, we might be able to help. Marcus has been getting regular raises, and my commission income has been growing steadily." "I'm not having money problems," I said. "In fact, that's exactly the misconception I need to address." I walked to my purse and pulled out the folder of documents I'd been reviewing the night before. "I think it's time you understood my actual financial situation instead of making assumptions based on my spending habits." I placed the bank statements on the table, showing current balances that made both of them stare in shock. Marcus picked up the top statement and studied it as if he thought it might be a forgery. "Mom, this account has over $400,000 in it." "That's my checking account," I replied. "It covers monthly expenses and gives me ready access to cash for unexpected costs." Cassandra grabbed the investment portfolio summary, and her eyes widened as she scanned the numbers. "Eleanor, according to this, you have over $2 million in stocks and bonds." $2.3 million actually. That statement is from last quarter, and the markets have been doing well. Marcus was staring at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted a second head. "I don't understand. If you have this much money, why do you shop at discount stores? Why do you worry about utility bills? Why do you drive a 10-year-old car?" "Because I don't spend money just because I have it," I replied. "Your father and I built this wealth by living below our means and investing the difference. Just because someone can afford luxury doesn't mean they need to live luxuriously." "But you let us think you were struggling," Cassandra said, her voice rising. "You let us worry about your finances, offer to help with expenses, plan for your future care based on completely wrong information." "I never said I was struggling," I corrected. "You assumed I was struggling because I live modestly. There's a difference between being poor and choosing not to be wasteful." Marcus set down the bank statement with shaking hands. "Mom, do you understand how this changes everything? If we'd known you were financially secure, we never would have suggested you move to senior living. We thought you needed help, not independence." "Did you?" I asked. Because the senior living suggestions started around the same time Cassandra began redecorating my house and converting my spaces to your uses. It seemed less like concern for my welfare, and more like a desire for my real estate. Cassandra's face had gone pale, but her voice remained defiant. "That's not fair. We genuinely thought you were struggling to maintain this house. The way you budget, the way you comparison shop, the way you research every purchase. Those are signs of financial stress. Those are signs of financial responsibility," I replied. "Which is probably why I have $2 million while you're struggling to afford a modest rental apartment." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of the coffee maker finishing its brewing cycle. I watched as both of them processed this new information and tried to recalibrate their understanding of our family dynamic. Finally, Marcus spoke. "If you're this financially secure, why did you let me move in here after my divorce? Why didn't you just give me money to get my own place?" "Because you needed to rebuild your confidence and your relationship with Jake, not receive a financial bailout," I replied. "I thought having family time together would be healing for all of us. And it was until someone decided that temporary help entitled them to permanent control. I gathered the financial documents and returned them to my purse. The point I'm trying to make is that my decisions about where to live and how to spend my time aren't based on financial limitations. They're based on my preferences and priorities." "Eleanor," Cassandra said carefully, "if money isn't an issue, then maybe we can work out a different arrangement. Maybe we could help you renovate this house. Update it to make it more comfortable for everyone." It was exactly the kind of proposal I'd expected once they understood my actual resources. Now that they knew I could afford to invest in the property, they wanted to help me spend money in ways that would benefit them. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. "The house is perfectly comfortable for me as it is," I said. Or rather, it was until someone started changing everything without asking my permission. "But Eleanor, with your resources, you could do amazing things with this place. A kitchen renovation, bathroom upgrades, maybe even an addition that would give everyone more space." "More space for whom?" I asked. "I'm not planning to add more occupants to this house. In fact, I'm planning to reduce the current number of occupants." Marcus looked stricken. "Mom, now that we understand your situation better, can't we start over? Can't we find a way to make this work that respects everyone's needs?" "Marcus, what are your actual needs?" I asked. "Not your wants or preferences, but your genuine needs for housing your family." He considered the question seriously. "We need 3 bedrooms for me, Cassandra and Jake. We need a safe neighborhood with good schools. We need to be within reasonable commuting distance of our jobs. And how much can you realistically afford to pay for housing that meets those needs?" "Maybe $1,800 to $2,000 a month, including utilities." I nodded. "Then you need to find housing that costs $1,800 to $2,000 a month. That's how housing markets work. People find accommodations they can afford, not accommodations they prefer." "But Mom," Marcus said desperately, "this house has been Jake's home for 2 years. He's settled here, comfortable here. Moving would be disruptive for him." It was a fair point, and one that tugged at my grandmother's heart, even as my rational mind recognized it as emotional manipulation. Jake had indeed settled into this house, had claimed his bedroom and established routines around the garden and neighborhood. Uprooting him would be difficult, especially since he'd already experienced the disruption of his parents' divorce. "You should have considered Jake's need for stability before you started pressuring me to move out," I replied. "You can't use his comfort as a reason to avoid the consequences of your own choices." Cassandra had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now she leaned forward with the intense focus that probably served her well in real estate negotiations. "Eleanor, let me ask you something, as a professional. If you were looking at this situation from a purely practical standpoint, what would make the most sense for everyone involved?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you have a large house that you don't really need, and we have a growing family that needs space. You have significant financial resources, and we have the energy and time to help maintain the property. Instead of seeing this as a conflict, why not see it as an opportunity for a mutually beneficial arrangement?" I had to admire her persistence. Even after having her assumptions about my financial vulnerability completely overturned, she was still looking for angles that might let them stay in my house on their terms. "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" "A partnership. You maintain ownership of the house, but we take responsibility for maintenance, improvements, and day-to-day management. We split the costs based on usage, maybe with you paying a larger share, since you have more resources, but with decisions being made jointly since we're all invested in the property." It was a sophisticated proposal that addressed some of the practical issues, while completely ignoring the fundamental problem. I didn't want partners in managing my own home. I wanted autonomy, privacy, and the right to make decisions about my own living space without consultation or compromise. "Cassandra, That sounds like a reasonable business arrangement, I said. But I don't want a business arrangement for my home. I want to live in my house, in my space according to my preferences and schedule. But you're rattling around in all this space by yourself, Marcus protested. Wouldn't it be nice to have family around, to share meals and experiences, to have help when you need it? I've been sharing meals and experiences with family for 2 years, I replied. During that time, I've watched my preferences be dismissed, my belongings be relocated, my spaces be converted to other uses, and my authority be gradually undermined. That's not the kind of family sharing I want to continue. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the garden that represented everything I'd built and nurtured over the decades. Marcus, do you remember when you were 12, and you wanted to build a tree house in the oak tree? You and Dad helped me design it and gather materials. Do you remember what you told me when I suggested that your sister Melissa might want to help with the project? Marcus smiled slightly. I said I wanted it to be my special place, where I could go when I needed time alone. And what did your father and I do? You respected that, you helped me build my tree house, and you made sure Melissa understood that she needed to ask permission before coming up. Even though it was our tree, in our yard, and we were paying for the materials. Why do you think we did that? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Because you understood that everyone needs space that feels like theirs, even kids. Especially kids, I corrected. Because learning to respect other people's space and autonomy is one of the most important lessons children can learn. I turned back to face him. I'm asking for the same respect you needed when you were 12. I want space that feels like mine, where I can make decisions without consultation, where my preferences take priority, because it's my place. But Mom, you're not 12, you're part of a family. Yes, I am, but being part of a family doesn't mean giving up individual identity and autonomy. It means finding ways to maintain loving relationships while respecting each other's boundaries and needs. Cassandra had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration, and now she exploded. This is ridiculous. You're talking about boundaries and autonomy like you're dealing with strangers instead of family. Families make compromises. Families share resources. Families take care of each other. You're absolutely right, I agreed. Families do all of those things. But taking care of each other doesn't mean one family member gives up everything while others benefit from her sacrifices. No one asked you to give up everything, Marcus protested. Didn't they? You asked me to give up my home, my garden, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own living situation. What exactly was I being asked to keep? I walked back to the table and sat down, feeling suddenly tired by the weight of this conversation. Marcus, I love you and Jake more than anything in the world, but I won't sacrifice my autonomy to prove that love. What if we could find a middle ground? He asked desperately. What if we made changes to address your concerns, while still finding a way to stay together as a family? What kind of changes? Restore your furniture, give you back your sewing room, ask permission before making any modifications to the house. Treat this as your home, with us as guests instead of treating it as shared space. It was closer to what I might have accepted 6 months ago, before the situation had deteriorated so completely. But too much damage had been done to simply reset the relationship to an earlier, more respectful dynamic. Marcus, the problem isn't just about furniture and room assignments. The problem is about fundamental attitudes toward my capabilities and rights. Until 3 days ago, you and Cassandra were planning to convince me to move to senior living. That's not something I can forget, or forgive easily. We thought we were helping, Cassandra said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. You thought you were solving a problem that benefited you, I replied. My supposed need for care and supervision was convenient justification for getting me out of the way, so you could have my house. The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke. Even Marcus couldn't deny that their concern for my welfare had aligned suspiciously well with their desire for my real estate. So what happens now? Marcus asked quietly. Do we pack up and move out, or do we try to work something out? That depends on whether you can afford the rental rate I offered, I said. If you can't afford it, then you need to find housing you can afford. If you can afford it, then we can discuss the terms of a formal lease agreement. And if we move out, what kind of relationship do you want with us? With Jake, the question that mattered most, the one that would determine whether this family could survive the conflict that had erupted around my dining room table. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and honorable, who'd lost his way under the influence of someone who didn't share those values. I want the kind of relationship where you visit because you enjoy my company, not because you need something from me, I said. I want to be Jake's grandmother, who takes him on adventures and spoils him with attention, not the woman he lives with who's always available but never prioritized. We do enjoy your company, Marcus said softly. Do you? Because for the past year, most of our interactions have felt like negotiations. You're managing me, handling me, trying to guide me toward decisions that make your lives easier. I reached across the table and touched his hand. Marcus, I don't want to lose you or Jake. But I also don't want to continue a relationship that requires me to minimize myself so you can feel more important. Tears were forming in his eyes. I never wanted you to minimize yourself, Mom. I just didn't know how to handle everything after Dad died. Having you depend on me made me feel useful, like I was honoring his memory by taking care of you. But I wasn't depending on you, I replied gently. I was allowing you to help, because I thought it would be good for both of us. There's a difference between needing help and accepting it. I think I understand that now. Cassandra had been watching this exchange with the calculating expression of someone trying to figure out how to turn an emotional moment to her advantage. Now she cleared her throat and spoke in the artificially warm tone she used when she wanted something. Eleanor, I owe you an apology. I realize now that I misunderstood your situation and made assumptions that weren't fair to you. If we could start over knowing what we know now, I think we could build a much better relationship. It was exactly the kind of apology I'd expected once she realized that her original strategy had backfired. Not an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but a request for a do-over now that she understood the actual power dynamics. I appreciate the apology, Cassandra, I said. But starting over would require trust, and trust has to be earned over time through consistent actions, not just words. What kind of actions would help rebuild that trust? I considered the question seriously. What would it take for me to believe that Cassandra respected my autonomy and wasn't just recalibrating her manipulation tactics? Honest communication about your needs and resources instead of manipulation based on false assumptions about mine, I said. Respect for my decisions about my own home and lifestyle, instead of pressure to change things for your convenience. Acknowledgement that I'm a competent adult, instead of treatment like a confused elderly person who needs guidance. I can do those things, Cassandra said eagerly. Can you? Because doing those things would mean accepting that you can't have everything you want just because you want it. It would mean finding housing you can afford instead of pressuring me to subsidize housing you prefer. It would mean building your own financial security instead of positioning yourselves to inherit mine. The kitchen fell silent again. Through the window I could see Jake playing in the backyard, chasing butterflies among the flower beds with the carefree joy that made all adult complications seem both urgent and trivial. We need some time to think about everything, Marcus said finally. This is a lot to process. Of course, you have 60 days to decide what works best for your family. And after those 60 days, regardless of what we decide, you'll still be Jake's grandmother. I'll always be Jake's grandmother, I assured him. The question is whether I'll be the grandmother who lives with you or the grandmother who lives in her own home and sees you when we choose to spend time together. Marcus nodded slowly. I think I understand the difference now. I hope so, I said. Because one of those relationships allows me to maintain my identity and independence, and the other requires me to sacrifice both in order to make everyone else comfortable. I stood up and began clearing the coffee cups from the table, a normal domestic task that felt strange in the context of the conversation we'd just had. I'm going to spend the morning in the garden. You're welcome to join me if you'd like, or you can continue researching your housing options. As I reached the kitchen door, Cassandra called after me. Eleanor, what if we agreed to pay the rent you're asking? What would that mean for how we live together? I turned back to face her. It would mean you're tenants, and I'm your landlord. It would mean you have the rights and responsibilities outlined in the lease agreement, and I have the rights and responsibilities of a property owner. But we'd still be family. We'd be family members who happen to have a business relationship regarding housing, I replied. Those are two separate things that would need to be managed separately. I left them in the kitchen and went outside to tend my garden, where the morning sun was illuminating the greenhouse and the raised beds that had fed our family for 2 growing seasons. As I worked among the tomato plants and herb gardens, I found myself thinking about the conversation that had just unfolded, and the choices that lay ahead for all of us. For 2 years, I'd been accommodating everyone else's needs while minimizing my own. I'd been the helpful grandmother, the supportive mother-in-law, the woman who made everyone's life easier by asking for nothing in return. But accommodation without boundaries had become enabling, and enabling had become exploitation. The truth was that Marcus and Cassandra had never intended to harm me. They'd simply pursued their own interests without considering the impact on mine, and they'd done it so gradually that none of us had noticed how completely the balance of power had shifted. But now the balance was shifting back, and they were struggling to adjust to a reality where my needs and preferences mattered as much as theirs. Whether they could make that adjustment would determine not just where they lived, but whether our family relationships could survive the transition. As I worked in the soil that Thomas and I had enriched over decades of careful tending, I felt more like myself than I had in months. This was my garden, in my yard, behind my house, nurtured by my labor and sustained by my resources. Whatever happened with Marcus and Cassandra, this space would remain mine, and for the first time since Thomas's death, that felt like enough. 3 weeks later, I was in my kitchen making Jake's favorite chocolate chip pancakes when I heard the distinctive sound of moving boxes being stacked in the hallway upstairs. Through the ceiling, I could hear Marcus and Cassandra talking in low, urgent voices as they packed their belongings into containers that would transport their lives to a new address. They'd chosen to move out rather than pay rent, a decision that had taken them 2 weeks of apartment hunting and financial calculations to reach. The rental market had been an eye-opening experience for them, apparently. Every suitable 3-bedroom apartment in a decent school district cost more than the $2,800 I'd offered to charge them, and most came with additional fees, security deposits, and restrictions that made my lease terms look generous by comparison. I'd watched this process unfold with a mixture of sympathy and vindication. Sympathy because housing costs were genuinely challenging for young families, especially those who'd grown accustomed to living beyond their means. Vindication because their sticker shock confirmed what I'd suspected all along: they'd never truly understood the value of what I'd been providing. The apartment they'd finally chosen was a modest 2-bedroom unit about 20 minutes away, in a complex with a playground and a school within walking distance. It cost them $2,200 per month plus utilities, which meant they were paying nearly as much for significantly less space, but without the stigma of paying rent to a family member. Marcus had presented this choice to me as if it were a victory of independence over dependence, a mature decision to build their own life, rather than remain tied to mine. I'd agreed that it seemed like the right choice for their family, and I'd meant it. They needed to discover what they could actually afford and accomplish on their own, without the safety net of my subsidized housing. The hardest part had been explaining the change to Jake, who'd absorbed the news of another move with the weary resignation of a child who'd learned not to get too attached to any living situation. At 4 years old, he'd already lived in 4 different homes: his birth mother's apartment, Marcus's post-divorce rental, my house, and now the new apartment with Cassandra. "Will I still see you every day, Grandma Eleanor?" he'd asked when Marcus told him about the move. "You'll see me whenever your daddy brings you to visit," I'd answered honestly. "Maybe not every day, but definitely regularly. Can I still help you in the garden?" "Of course, sweetheart. The garden will miss you when you're not here, so we'll have to make sure you visit often enough to keep the plants happy." Now listening to their packing progress, I tried to identify the emotions swirling through my chest. Relief was certainly there, the prospect of having my space and autonomy restored, after months of feeling like a guest in my own home. But there was sadness too, genuine grief at the end of a living arrangement that had brought me closer to my grandson than I'd ever been. For 2 years I'd been part of Jake's daily routine. I'd made his breakfast most mornings, walked him to the school bus stop, helped with homework, and read bedtime stories almost every night. I'd watched him grow from a shy 2-year-old adjusting to his parents' divorce into a confident 4-year-old, ready to start kindergarten in the fall. That daily involvement would end now, replaced by scheduled visits and planned activities that would feel more formal and less spontaneous. I would no longer witness the small moments that revealed his developing personality, the casual conversations that showed how his mind worked, the gradual accumulation of experiences that shaped childhood. But I would also no longer have to navigate the constant tension of living with Cassandra, the careful diplomacy required to maintain peace while protecting my own interests. I would no longer have to watch my belongings disappear or my spaces be converted to purposes I hadn't approved. I would no longer have to smile politely while listening to suggestions about how I should live my life. Grandma Eleanor, Jake's voice interrupted my thoughts as he appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his dinosaur pajamas despite the late morning hour. Daddy says we're taking all my toys to the new place, but can I leave some here for when I visit? Of course you can, sweetheart. Would you like to choose which toys you want to keep in your visiting room? His face brightened. I have a visiting room? You'll always have a room here, I assured him. It might not be exactly the same as your bedroom now, but there will always be a space that's yours when you come to see me. Jake climbed onto one of the kitchen stools and reached for the bowl of chocolate chips I'd been using for the pancakes. Daddy seems sad about moving. He keeps looking around the house like he's trying to remember everything. The observation was more perceptive than I would have expected from a 4-year-old, but Jake had always been unusually attuned to adult emotions. Growing up in a household with frequent tension had probably accelerated his ability to read moods and anticipate conflicts. Moving can be sad even when it's the right thing to do, I told him. Your daddy loves this house because it's where he grew up, where he has lots of memories with Grandpa Thomas and me. But you're not sad. I considered the question carefully. I'm sad that we won't see each other every day anymore, but I'm not sad about the moving. Sometimes people need to live in different places to be happy. Like when me and Daddy moved here after Mommy Sarah went away. Exactly like that. Sometimes moving helps families figure out what they really need. Jake nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to his young understanding of how adult relationships worked. He'd already learned that families could be reconfigured, that love didn't always mean living in the same house, that people could care about each other from a distance. After Jake went back upstairs to continue packing his toys, I found myself wandering through the rooms that would soon be mine alone again. The living room, where I could now restore my antique furniture and family photographs. The family room, where I could remove the lock Cassandra had installed and return it to its original purpose, as a comfortable gathering space. My sewing room, where I could set up my machine again, and return to the quilting projects I'd abandoned when the space was converted to Cassandra's office. The guest room, which could actually serve as a guest room again, instead of housing Marcus and Cassandra's overflow belongings. But it was the kitchen that felt most symbolic of the changes ahead. For 2 years, this space had been dominated by Cassandra's preferences for meal planning, grocery shopping, and food preparation. She'd replaced my grandmother's mixing bowls with modern stainless steel versions, swapped my cast iron skillets for non-stick pans, and insisted on organizing the pantry according to some system that made sense to her but confounded me. Soon I could cook my own meals according to my own schedule, using my own recipes and my own methods. I could return to the simple pleasure of preparing food from my garden, creating meals that connected me to the soil and seasons rather than the convenience culture that Cassandra preferred.
Mom? Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking uncertain and somehow younger than his 35 years. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Of course. I gestured toward the kitchen table where we'd had so many difficult conversations over the past month. How's the packing going? It's going fine, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. He sat down across from me and ran his hands through his hair, a nervous gesture he'd maintained since childhood. I wanted to apologize for everything that's happened, and to ask if there's any way we can repair our relationship. Marcus, our relationship doesn't need repair. It needs adjustment. What's the difference? I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him, buying time to organize my thoughts. Repair implies that something was broken by accident and needs to be fixed. Adjustment implies that something functional needs to be modified to work better. I don't understand. Our relationship wasn't broken by misunderstanding or poor communication, I explained. It was strained by assumptions and expectations that didn't match reality. Those assumptions need to be adjusted, not repaired.
Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth. What assumptions do you mean? Your assumption that I needed your protection and guidance. My assumption that accepting your help was the same as appreciating it. Cassandra's assumption that I was financially vulnerable and socially isolated. Those weren't malicious assumptions. No, they weren't, but they were wrong, and they led to decisions that didn't serve anyone's best interests. I sat down across from him and studied his face, looking for signs of the boy I'd raised and the man I hoped he could still become. Marcus, do you remember what your father used to say about assumptions? That they make an ass out of you and me. I smiled despite the seriousness of our conversation. That was his crude version, yes. But he also used to say that assumptions are just lazy thinking disguised as insight. I remember that now. Your father and I never assumed we knew what was best for each other. When we made decisions that affected both of us, we discussed our actual needs and preferences instead of guessing what they might be. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he was just beginning to understand how to ask. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. All right, do you think I'm like Dad? Do you think I have his character, his integrity, his strength? The question caught me off guard, both because of its vulnerability and because of what it revealed about Marcus's deepest fears. He wasn't just worried about our relationship or his housing situation, he was worried about his fundamental worth as a man and a father. Marcus, you have your father's kindness and his intelligence, I said carefully. You have his capacity for love and his desire to do right by his family. But you also have something your father never struggled with. A tendency to let other people's agendas become more important than your own judgment. Marcus winced as if I'd slapped him. You think I'm weak. I think you're eager to please, and I think some people have taken advantage of that eagerness. Cassandra, you mean? I chose my words carefully. I think Cassandra is very good at identifying what people want to hear and telling them exactly that. She convinced you that I needed protection by telling you what a devoted son you were. She convinced you that I was becoming a burden by praising your patience and generosity. So you think she manipulated me? I think she recognized your desire to honor your father's memory by taking care of me, and she used that desire to achieve her own goals. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his back rigid with tension. Do you think I'm stupid for marrying her? I think you were lonely and grieving, and she was smart enough to offer exactly what you needed at exactly the right time. But now, I considered the question honestly. Now I think you need to decide whether the person she becomes when she doesn't get what she wants is someone you want to spend your life with. I mean that Cassandra was charming and accommodating when she thought I was a helpless widow who could be convinced to give up my house. When she discovered I was a financially secure woman who intended to keep my independence, she became angry and vindictive. Marcus turned back to face me. She's been under a lot of stress with the move and everything. Marcus, stress reveals character, it doesn't create it. The truth of that statement settled between us like dust after an explosion. For 3 weeks I'd watched Cassandra struggle with the reality that her original plan had failed, and her response had been instructive. Instead of accepting responsibility for her miscalculations, she'd blamed me for being deceptive about my finances. Instead of acknowledging that her treatment of me had been disrespectful, she'd accused me of being oversensitive about normal family dynamics. She keeps saying you tricked us about your money, Marcus said quietly. Do you believe that? I don't know what to believe anymore. I walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept important documents and pulled out the folder containing my financial statements. Marcus, these accounts exist because your father and I saved money for 50 years. We lived below our means, invested wisely, and never touched our retirement savings even when we could have afforded luxuries. I opened the folder and showed him statements going back to before his birth. This isn't new money or secret money. It's the same money that paid for your college education, your first car, the down payment on your first house. The same money that allowed me to stay home with you when you were young, instead of working full-time. Marcus studied the statements with growing understanding. You were always financially secure, always, but your father and I believed in teaching you the value of work and self-reliance, so we never flaunted our wealth or made you feel entitled to it. And I interpreted your discretion as evidence of struggle.
You interpreted my frugal habits as signs of poverty instead of signs of the discipline that created wealth in the first place. Marcus returned to his chair and buried his face in his hands. I feel like such an idiot. You're not an idiot. You made assumptions based on incomplete information, and then you made decisions based on those assumptions. It's a common mistake, but the consequences weren't common. I almost convinced my own mother to give up her home based on a complete misunderstanding of her situation. But you didn't actually do it. Marcus looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Only because you were strong enough to stop me, and smart enough to document everything, and wealthy enough to hire good legal advice, I added. Not everyone in my situation would have had those advantages. The implications of that reality hung in the air between us. How many elderly people had been convinced to give up their independence by well-meaning family members who didn't understand their actual capabilities or resources? How many had lost their autonomy not through genuine incapacity but through other people's assumptions about age and vulnerability? Mom, can I ask you something else? Of course. If I hadn't married Cassandra, would things have been different between us? I considered the question carefully. Some things would have been different, but the fundamental issues might have emerged anyway. What do you mean? I mean that I was already diminishing myself after your father's death, already accepting less authority and independence than I was capable of maintaining. Cassandra accelerated that process, but she didn't create it. So you're saying this was partly your own fault. I'm saying that grief made me passive, and passive people invite others to make decisions for them. Cassandra simply accepted that invitation more aggressively than you did. I reached across the table and touched his hand. Marcus, the important thing isn't assigning blame for what happened. It's learning from it so we can build something better going forward. What would better look like? Better would look like honest communication about our actual needs and capabilities. Better would look like mutual respect for each other's autonomy and choices. Better would look like family relationships based on affection rather than assumptions about obligation or dependency. And you think we can achieve that even though I'm married to someone you don't trust? It was the question that had been hovering around all our conversations for the past month, the question that would determine whether our family could survive the changes we'd all experienced. Marcus, I don't have to trust Cassandra to love you and Jake, I said finally. But I do need to trust that you won't allow her to make decisions about my life or my resources. What if she keeps pushing for things you're not comfortable with? Then you'll need to decide whether protecting my boundaries is more important than keeping peace in your marriage. Marcus was quiet for a long time, absorbing the weight of what I'd just asked him to consider. Eventually he nodded slowly. I understand what you're saying, and I think you're right. I just don't know if I'm strong enough to stand up to her when she's really determined to get something. Then maybe this move will be good for both of you, I suggested. Maybe having your own space will give you room to figure out who you are as a husband and father without the complications of living in someone else's house. I hope so. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking our coffee and listening to the sounds of packing upstairs. Finally Marcus spoke again. Mom, regardless of what happens with my marriage, I want you to know that I've learned something important from all this. What's that? I've learned that taking care of someone doesn't mean making decisions for them. It means supporting their ability to make their own decisions. That's a very mature insight. It's also something I want to teach Jake as he grows up. I want him to understand that love and respect go together, that you can't claim to care about someone while ignoring their autonomy. I think that's one of the most important lessons any child can learn. Marcus stood up and hugged me, the first genuine embrace we'd shared in months. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I was acting like an idiot. You're my son, I replied simply. I'll never give up on you. After Marcus went back upstairs to continue packing, I spent the afternoon making phone calls to friends I hadn't seen much during the past 2 years of intensive grandmothering. My sister Patricia, my former colleagues from the hospital, my gardening club members who'd been wondering where I'd disappeared to. Each conversation reminded me of aspects of my identity that had been dormant while I focused on family caregiving. Patricia wanted to plan a sister vacation to the coast. My friend Helen was organizing a group trip to visit botanical gardens in 3 different states. The gardening club was planning a fall tour of private gardens that would include mine if I was interested in participating.
These were opportunities I'd been declining or ignoring while I prioritized my role as live-in grandmother and household manager. Now, with that role ending, I could reclaim other parts of myself that had nothing to do with family obligations. That evening, I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple while Jake played among the flower beds for what might be his last evening as a resident of this house. Tomorrow, the moving truck would come to transport his family's belongings to their new apartment, and this chapter of our lives together would officially close. Grandma Eleanor. Jake appeared at my elbow, his hands dirty from digging in the herb garden where I'd been teaching him to identify plants by their scent and texture. Yes, sweetheart. Will you still be my grandma when I don't live here anymore? I'll always be your grandma no matter where any of us live. But will I still be your grandson? The question revealed a 4-year-old's anxiety about the permanence of relationships, his need for reassurance that love doesn't depend on proximity or living arrangements. Jake, do you know what makes someone a grandmother and grandson? He shook his head, settling onto the garden bench beside me. It's not about living in the same house or seeing each other every day. It's about love and family connection that stays strong no matter what changes happen in our lives. Like how I'm still Mommy Sarah's son even though I don't live with her anymore. Exactly like that. Family love doesn't disappear just because family members live in different places. Jake considered this explanation with the seriousness children bring to concepts that matter to their sense of security. So even when I'm at the new apartment, I'll still be thinking about you and you'll still be thinking about me. Every single day, I promised. And whenever you want to visit, we'll find a way to make that happen. Can I call you on the phone when I miss you? Anytime you want to hear my voice, you can call me. And anytime I want to hear yours, I can call you. Jake leaned against my shoulder with the trusting weight of childhood, and I wrapped my arm around him while we watched the last light fade from the garden. Tomorrow would bring change and adjustment for all of us, but tonight we had this peaceful moment together in the space where I'd taught him to plant seeds and watch them grow. Moving day arrived with the efficiency of any major life transition, organized chaos punctuated by moments of genuine emotion. The moving truck appeared in my driveway at 8 in the morning, followed by a crew of 3 men who approached their task with professional detachment. I'd volunteered to take Jake to the park while the heavy lifting happened, partly to keep him out of the way and partly to spare myself the emotional complexity of watching my son's life be packed into boxes and loaded onto a truck. We spent the morning at the playground where Jake had played dozens of times over the past 2 years, where I'd pushed him on swings and helped him navigate monkey bars that had seemed impossibly challenging when he'd first arrived at my house as a newly turned 2-year-old. Grandma Eleanor, will there be a playground at the new apartment? He asked as we sat on the swings, moving gently back and forth in the late morning sunshine. Your daddy said there's a playground right outside your new building, I reminded him. You'll be able to play there whenever you want and you won't need anyone to drive you there. But will you come visit me at the new playground sometimes? I'd love to visit you at the new playground. Maybe we can explore it together the first time you show it to me. Jake's face brightened with the resilience that had carried him through multiple transitions already in his short life. I can show you all the best parts, like the big slide and the spinning thing that makes you dizzy. That sounds like an adventure I wouldn't want to miss. When we returned to the house around noon, the moving truck was nearly loaded and the rooms that had housed Marcus's family for 2 years were returning to their empty, echoing state. Furniture marks on the carpet showed where beds and dressers had stood. Nail holes in the walls marked where family photos had been displayed. Cassandra was directing the movers with the authoritative efficiency that had probably served her well in real estate, but her interactions with me remained coolly polite. She'd clearly decided that maintaining a surface-level civility was preferable to open conflict, but the underlying resentment was still visible in her careful avoidance of direct eye contact or casual conversation. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed almost relieved as he watched his possessions disappear into the truck. The stress of the past month had been evident in his posture and expression, and now that the decision was final and the action was underway, some of that tension appeared to be lifting. Mom, he said as we stood in the doorway watching the last of their boxes being loaded, thank you for making this as easy as it could be under the circumstances. You're welcome. I want this transition to be as smooth as possible for Jake's sake. I know, and I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to make sure he stays connected to you and to this house. I appreciate that, Marcus. The moving truck pulled out of my driveway at 2:30 in the afternoon, followed by Marcus's car with Cassandra in the passenger seat and Jake waving at me from his booster seat in the back. I stood on my front porch watching until they turned the corner and disappeared from view, then walked back into my house to assess the silence that had replaced 2 years of family noise. The quiet was profound but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of possibility, of space waiting to be reclaimed and reorganized according to my own preferences and schedule. For the first time in years, I could walk through my house without considering anyone else's needs or expectations. I started in the living room, where I could now return my antique furniture from the basement and restore the family photographs that had been relegated to less prominent positions. The modern pieces Cassandra had chosen were attractive but impersonal, suitable for a showroom but not for a home where real life happened. By evening, I'd rearranged the living room to reflect my own taste and history, and the transformation was remarkable. The space felt welcoming again, lived in rather than staged, comfortable rather than impressive. When I settled into Thomas's reading chair with a cup of tea and one of the books I'd been meaning to read for months, I felt more at home than I had in my own house for longer than I cared to calculate. The phone rang around 7 o'clock, and Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID. "Hi sweetheart, how's the unpacking going?" "It's going well, Jake's room is set up, and he seems excited about the new space. But Mom, he's asking when he can come visit you. Would it be okay if we brought him by this weekend?" "Of course. I'd love to see how he's settling in, and I have some books I've been saving for him." "Great, and Mom, I know this is probably too soon to ask, but would you be willing to have dinner with us sometime? All of us, I mean, including Cassandra." I considered the request carefully. "Marcus, I'm willing to have civil relationships with everyone in your family, but rebuilding trust will take time. Let's start with visits focused on Jake, and we can see how that goes." "That's fair. I just wanted you to know that the invitation is open when you're ready." After we hung up, I walked through my house again, this time focusing on the changes I wanted to make now that the space was truly mine. The family room where I could remove Cassandra's lock and restore the comfortable, casual atmosphere it had once had. The guest room where I could set up my sewing machine and return to the quilting projects that had been gathering dust in the basement. But it was the kitchen that felt most symbolic of my reclaimed independence. Tomorrow I would go grocery shopping for one person again, buying the foods I preferred and cooking the meals I enjoyed. I would return to the simple pleasure of preparing vegetables from my garden, creating dishes that connected me to the seasons and the soil rather than the convenience culture that had dominated our family meals. As I made myself a light dinner of salad greens and herbs from the garden, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Marcus earlier that day and the insights he'd shared about learning to support someone's autonomy rather than making decisions for them. It had taken a crisis to teach him that lesson, but he'd genuinely learned it. Whether he would be able to apply it in his marriage remained to be seen, but at least he now understood the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. The doorbell rang just as I was finishing my dinner, and I found my neighbor Helen standing on my front porch with a bottle of wine and a curious expression. "Eleanor, I saw the moving truck today and I wanted to make sure everything was all right. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Helen. Better than fine, actually. Marcus and his family have moved to their own apartment and I'm reclaiming my space." Helen's face brightened with understanding. "Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, I'm sure you'll miss having Jake around, but having your house back to yourself must feel amazing." "It really does. Well, in that case, this bottle of wine is for celebrating your independence instead of consoling your loneliness." We sat on my front porch watching the evening settle over the neighborhood, while Helen filled me in on all the community news I'd missed during my years of intensive grandmothering. The annual garden tour was being planned for October, and several people had suggested including my garden if I was interested. The book club I'd belonged to before Jake's arrival was reading a novel I'd been wanting to discuss with other people. "Eleanor, you disappeared from so many activities when Marcus moved in," Helen observed. "We all assumed you were too busy with family responsibilities to maintain your friendships." "I was too busy, but I realize now that was a choice I made rather than a necessity. I prioritized family caregiving over everything else in my life, including my own interests and relationships. And now I'm remembering that I have an identity beyond grandmother and mother-in-law. I'm remembering interests and friendships that don't depend on family obligations." Helen raised her wine glass in a toast, "To rediscovering yourself at 68.
To never losing yourself again, I replied. That night, I went to sleep in my own house for the first time in 2 years without considering anyone else's schedule, preferences, or needs. I could read as late as I wanted, wake up when I chose, and spend my days according to my own priorities rather than family dynamics. But it wasn't the absence of obligation that felt most significant. It was the presence of choice, the restoration of agency over my own life, the return of autonomy I'd gradually surrendered, without realizing how much I'd missed it. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that faced east toward the garden, and I realized I was smiling before I was fully conscious. For the first time in years, I had a day ahead of me that belonged entirely to me, a day I could shape according to my own desires and interests. I made coffee and carried it out to the garden, where the morning light was illuminating the greenhouse and the raised beds that had sustained our family through 2 growing seasons. The tomatoes were ripening, the herbs were flourishing, and the late summer flowers were providing a spectacular display of color and texture. This was my garden, created by my labor and sustained by my knowledge, nurtured through seasons of growth and dormancy by my patient attention. Whatever changes lay ahead for my family relationships, this space would remain constant, a reminder of what I could create and maintain through my own efforts. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. "Good morning, Grandma Eleanor. I miss you in the garden. Can we visit soon?" I smiled and typed back. "Good morning, sweetheart. I miss you too. Come visit anytime you want to help me harvest tomatoes." Within minutes, my phone rang. "Grandma Eleanor, can we come today? Daddy says he can drive me over after lunch." "I would love that, Jake. I have some ripe tomatoes that need picking, and I think you're just the right size to help me reach the ones in the middle of the plants." After we hung up, I spent the morning preparing for Jake's visit, gathering harvest baskets and planning which garden tasks would be most interesting for a 4-year-old assistant. But I also spent time enjoying the quiet anticipation of a visit that would happen on my terms, in my space, according to my schedule. This was what I'd been working toward during all the difficult conversations and legal maneuvering of the past month: the right to love my family while maintaining my independence, to be a devoted grandmother while preserving my autonomy, to offer support and care without sacrificing my own identity and resources. When Marcus's car pulled into my driveway that afternoon, and Jake came running toward my garden gate, with the enthusiasm of a child who'd been missing his favorite playground, I felt the deep satisfaction of a plan that had worked exactly as intended. I was still Jake's grandmother, still Marcus's mother, still a central figure in their lives. But I was also Eleanor Hartman, 68 years old, financially secure, intellectually curious, socially connected, and fully capable of managing my own life according to my own preferences. The house at 1247 Maple Grove Drive was mine again, filled with my furniture, decorated with my photographs, organized according to my systems, and open to my family when I chose to invite them. The garden was mine to tend and harvest, the kitchen was mine to use for cooking meals I enjoyed, and the days were mine to structure around activities that brought me satisfaction and fulfillment. I'd reclaimed not just my physical space, but my sense of self. And watching Jake run toward me with his arms outstretched and his face bright with joy, I knew that independence and love were not opposing forces, but complementary ones that strengthened each other when properly balanced. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibilities I was free to pursue and choices I was empowered to make. At 68, I was finally learning that the most important privacy any person can have is the privacy of their own autonomy, the space to be themselves without permission or apology. And in that space, surrounded by the garden I'd created and the family I'd raised, I was exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.